Hey everybody, this is James Lindsay, and you are listening to the new Discourses Podcast. This episode is actually going to be kind of almost an audiobook for an essay I recently wrote, so I'm not going to give you a whole lot of preamble. I'm just going to read this long essay. The essay is 17,500 words, so this is, roughly a third of a standard book. So the essay is in 4 chapters. I'm not going to break this into 4 different podcasts, but I'm going to try to read the whole thing in one go. The name of the essay is The Woke Right's Elitist Coup Inside the MAGA Civil War, which is trying to articulate what's going on with the woke right and MAGA overall. So rather than summarizing and describing that, I'm just going to go ahead and read. By necessity, we begin here. Most of MAGA is not woke right. Few conservatives even lean woke right. Only some people claiming to be Christians, whether that's rightly or wrongly, are woke right. So who is and who isn't woke right? And what is its relationship to MAGA and to conservatism? What is woke? How is it waging a revolution against MAGA and conservatism? And how is that revolution proceeding so far? At what stage in the revolution is the woke right at present? In other words, as everyone is asking everywhere I go, what the hell is going on? My objective in this very long piece is to lay out the case about woke in detail in such a way that it allows me to explain what is going on with the woke right in both MAGA and the broader conservative movement right now, which is nothing short of a revolutionary coup by radicals for control over this half of American politics, if not American and all of Western life. My essential claim is that the radical woke right is enacting a political coup of MAGA and the conservative movement in roughly 3 or 4 stages. These stages are 1, the consolidation of elite power to direct the party, 2, consolidation of MAGA under their rule and organization, 3, seizing control of American and Western conservative politics from that party base, and 4, seizing control of American and Western political and economic power through that party base. My contention is that Phase 1 of this structured coup attempt has already been completed, and Phase 2 is well underway. The MAGA Civil War we're presently experiencing is the result of the main body of MAGA having become aware of the problem as Phase 2 proceeds. The main mechanism of conquest I present in this essay is something called elitist capture, which roughly follows a culturally Marxist Gramscian model based off the Western Marxist theory and practice of the Italian Antonio Gramsci from the early 20th century, which many elements of the woke right have explicitly embraced. I apologize to the reader for the length of the following presentation, but the component pieces must be explained in full to make the crucial argument in the last section. For those already familiar with woke and its nature as a cult, feel free to skip to section 4 to read, or I guess hear the key arguments about woke right and its coup against MAGA, which is the ultimate point of this presentation. Chapter 1, Understanding the Definition of Woke. Once again, we start by explaining that woke means something very specific. The correct name for woke is critical consciousness. It means nothing more and nothing less than this, and the controversial proposition I have made is the rather obvious point that critical consciousness can exist on the right as well as on the left. Section Woke is a worldview. Woke is a worldview, namely an activist worldview. Every architect of woke on the left understands it as such, whether they use the word directly, use sophisticated terminology like critical constructivism or critical hermeneutics, as does Kincheloe, or use gentler terms like theoretical lenses, as have the identity politicians on the woke left for years. Kincheloe is, for example, specific and literal in calling it a worldview, Weltanschauung, and Paulo Freire and Henry Giroux are specific and literal in calling it a permanent prophetic vision. That woke is a worldview means woke is a way of seeing the world and behaving in it. That woke worldview means adopting a conflict-based, us versus the world or friend-enemy distinction, oppressor versus oppressed explanation for the total operation of society, one in which everyone is necessarily a participant. The oppressors are the enemy. The oppressed are virtuous victims by definition because they are victims. The conflict is totalizing and society defining, not something that's merely happening or partly true. Waking up to believing the world is organized this way is called having a critical consciousness. That is what it means to be woke. Nothing more, nothing less, nothing different. True and false consciousness. In the woke view, most people in society are asleep in that they lack the necessary consciousness to understand the woke or allegedly hidden true view of the world. Many oppressors are asleep and do not realize their complicity in the so-called evil system. Most oppressed are asleep and do not realize they are oppressed. Both have a kind of false consciousness. That allegedly dim-witted view of the world is, in the woke worldview, created and maintained by the oppressors, both knowingly and at unawares through complicity, all to maintain their advantage over society, which they alone benefit from. A key job of the few who are awake is to awaken others, which means to help them adopt the woke conflict-based worldview. They are woke because they are awake. Erwache in German, as in the Nazi slogan Deutschland erwache, Germany awake, while most of them are still asleep. Something called consciousness raising is therefore a first and primary job of all wokes. They have to install the critical consciousness in others, who will then join them in solidarity in a bid to claim power and centrality in society, culture, politics, and economics to run the world from their woke view. Woke as critical consciousness. The allegedly hidden but true consciousness one might woke up to can take many forms, but it is always of the shape described above. That is, they can blame many groups or systems for usually their own oppression, giving rise to various species of the woke genus. It might be class consciousness, race consciousness, feminist consciousness, or others. It can also take forms of nationalist or reversed identitarian consciousness, normally associated with politics on the political right, hence woke right. In general, the awakened woke consciousness is always a critical consciousness, which I reiterate is a very specific thing. Unambiguously woke authors on the left describe it this way, quote, "Critical consciousness, the core of social justice teaching, is a heightened awareness of the world and the power structures that shape it," end quote. Their leftism makes it about social justice, which is a kind of radical egalitarianism, but the consciousness is, quote, "a heightened awareness of the world and the power structures that shape it," end quote. The woke right would not bend that awareness towards social justice, but to their own hierarchical ambitions and values, but they're still woke by virtue of having a critical consciousness behind how they see the world and act within it. Paulo Freire calls it seeing the reasons behind facts. Of course, the reasons behind facts are given by the woke worldview, revealing it as a lens or interpretive framing of facts that support the worldview. Another writer who is unambiguously woke left explains critical consciousness this way, quote, "Critical consciousness describes how oppressed or marginalized people learn to critically analyze their social conditions and act to change them," end quote. The crux of a critical consciousness is being or feeling oppressed about one's socio-political conditions and acting to change them. This disposition is not limited to actors on the political left, as we will discuss in detail in Section 3. How woke critical consciousness acts in the world. Critical consciousness means believing the world is organized in the woke way, as described above, and also believing that there are only three things that can be done about it. As Brazilian Marxist Paulo Freire had it in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, quote, for someone to achieve critical consciousness of his status as an oppressed man requires recognition of his reality as an oppressive reality, end quote. This articulation accords with everything above and is the motivation for woke activity. Where it comes from is Karl Marx, who opened the Communist Manifesto's main body in this way. Quote, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. The emphasis there is on, in a word, oppressor versus oppressed. Marx also said that the point of studying the world isn't to understand it, but to change it. Woke is intrinsically activist, from oppressed against oppressor, aiming for revolutionary reconstitution of the society at large, or settling for the common ruin of the contending classes. Being an activist, accordingly, is considered an intrinsic part of having critical consciousness, so it is also an intrinsic part of being woke. Woke worldviews always mix theory and practice, so it isn't enough to believe, you also have duties of conscience to advance woke belief and woke agendas. Again, turning to Frady, this time in The Politics of Education, quote, critical consciousness is brought about not through an intellectual effort alone, but through praxis, through the authentic union of action and reflection, end quote. Regarding this praxis first, more people have to be woke up to the right way to think and act, which comes from the right interpretation of the world, which is the woke one, quote, seeing the reasons behind the facts. Thus, their primary activity is to attempt by any means possible to spread the woke critical consciousness to others. That is, woke must always recruit. Second, their enemies have to be identified and destroyed. As I've discussed elsewhere, the three primary ways wokes destroy their enemies before they have the power to do so physically and literally are A, intellectual destruction, B, moral destruction, and C, psychological destruction. The woke worldview and much psychopathic abuse is used to position enemies as intellectually deficient, usually by showing they don't understand the woke doctrine, morally deficient, usually by using woke beliefs to claim they are complicit in the great evil of society or paid off by it, or psychologically deficient, usually by saying that they must be crazy or have had a break with reality for not going along with the woke doctrine and its bullying crowd. Third, they have to participate as activists against the unjust system in which they are a part. The entire point of the woke permanent prophetic vision is, as Henry Giroux explained in the introduction to Paulo Freire's The Politics of Education from 1985, to transform the world in alignment with its own maniacal views. Woke acts, quote, in that it views the kingdom of God as something to be created on earth, but only through a faith in both other human beings and the necessity of permanent struggle, end quote. Giroux tells us, woke activism is therefore always intrinsically collectivist and religiously fanatical, and it believes its charge is to build a perfect world that would result if the world was in line with its woke doctrine. Freire referred to having this awakened awareness as having critical consciousness, which may be a term of his coinage. The purpose of critical consciousness, Freire told us, is, quote, permanent cultural revolution, end quote. Woke, therefore, only means having a critical consciousness and acting upon it. It does not mean anything else, and it does not apply to anyone who does not have such a thing or act upon it. Critical consciousness and critical theory. Critical consciousness means having adopted critical theory. That's all it means. Therefore, woke means seeing the world through a critical theory. That's all it means. It doesn't mean anything else. Critical theory means believing power is at the bottom of everything in society and that dominant power is corrupt. It means knowing you cannot change the world on the existing terms, though you must change the world, so you must ruthlessly, that is, mostly unfairly, criticize those aspects of the world that you wish to change. This definition is consistent across many decades of literature, tracking back to 1937 in specific, when Max Horkheimer, then director of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, coined the term. It is the same term and idea used to describe everything we call woke on the left to this day, including in their own literature. Here's Max Horkheimer's description of it from 1969. Quote, "The critical theory which I conceived later is based on the idea that one cannot determine what is good, what a good society, a free society would look like, from within the society in which we now live. We lack the means. But in our work, we can bring up the negative aspects of this society which we want to change." End quote. Critical theory, as we're told by Allison Bailey in 2017 in an unambiguously woke education paper published in Hypatia, for example, means interrogating power's relevance to how we understand and know the world. She specifically contrasts it against the, quote, critical thinking tradition, which she says is concerned instead with, quote, epistemic adequacy, which is a fancy academic term that means knowing what you're talking about. She tells us about two academic traditions that diverge over two different meanings of the word critical, and writes, quote, "The critical thinking tradition is concerned primarily with epistemic adequacy. To be critical is to show good judgment in recognizing when arguments are faulty, assertions lack evidence, truth claims appeal to unreliable sources, or concepts are sloppily crafted and applied. For critical thinkers, the problem is that people fail to, quote, examine the assumptions, commitments, and logic of daily life. The basic problem is irrational, illogical, and unexamined living." End internal quote. In this tradition, sloppy claims can be identified and fixed by learning to apply the tools of formal and informal logic correctly. End quote. This view of critical thinking she contrasts directly with critical theory, which she sums up this way, quote, "Critical pedagogy begins from a different set of assumptions rooted in the neo-Marxian literature on critical theory commonly associated with the Frankfurt School. Here, the critical learner is someone who is empowered and motivated to seek justice and emancipation. Critical pedagogy regards the claims that students make in response to social justice issues not as propositions to be assessed for their truth value, but as expressions of power that function to reinscribe and perpetuate social inequalities. Its mission is to teach students ways of identifying and mapping how power shapes our understandings of the world. This is the first step toward resisting and transforming social injustices. By interrogating the politics of knowledge production, this tradition also calls into question the uses of the accepted critical thinking toolkit to determine epistemic adequacy." End quote. What she is saying is that critical thinking is itself corrupt and corrupting because the most relevant factor for understanding ideas and questioning them is asking how they are shaped by power, not whether or not they are true, accurate, sound, or valid. For woke thinking, anything that disagrees with woke thinking is an unjust application of the corrupt power-ruling society. Thinking this way is having a critical consciousness. Thinking this way is what it means to be woke. Woke and other ways of knowing. Because critical theory believes power shapes everything in society, that means critical theory is criticizing existing power in the hopes of replacing it with their own abusive power on the underlying hidden assumption that sometimes stated that everything is always power and that all power is ultimately abusive. Doing this means being woke. People who do not do this are not woke, even when they engage in criticism, including of actually oppressive structures. Critical consciousness is particularly concerned with how power shapes our abilities to know and communicate ideas. It is a Marxist approach to knowing before it is anything else, unless we just accept that the whole enterprise of woke is a Gnostic way of thinking before it is even Marxist. Critical consciousness partly means believing the ability to know and communicate ideas is completely captured by an illegitimate elite who use their status as elites to keep everyone in false consciousness for their own benefit. Critical consciousness is therefore a conspiracy theory. Woke is therefore a conspiracy theory. As a result, woke favors, quote, other ways of knowing, and, quote, marginalized knowledges over established knowledges, which they believe are corrupt by the systemic power they blame everything on. Again, they believe this because the fundamental woke belief is that political power contours everything in life, and all political power is currently held by an illegitimate elite who is abusing knowledge and communication to keep everyone else asleep, that is, to spread false consciousness. The woke view is that which the allegedly powerful elites allegedly don't want you to know, so you will stay asleep to their corruption, and it is therefore regarded as more likely to be true and superior to other claims. Favoring marginalized knowledges because of the woke conspiracy theory is therefore a big part of what it means to be woke. Holding dissident viewpoints and expressing them is not woke on its own. Woke as the outsider elite. The people who are already woke in the above sense therefore automatically represent a new, quote, elite, who, quote, know what time it is, because they allegedly broke free of the false consciousness and adopted a critical consciousness. This state could refer to the woke right people who, quote, know what time it is, regarding Marxist infiltration of our society being terminal and thus requiring a fully radical and revolutionary response. Or it could be Herbert Marcuse talking about the, quote, emergency and, quote, clear and present danger of the, quote, entire existing society in his 1965 woke leftist essay, Repressive Tolerance. It's the same both ways. Society is on the cusp of ruin, and only these radicals can save us, and only by throwing out the existing order and replacing it with their own woke one, while blaming the other side's radicals for the necessity of their radical action. Here's how Marcuse said it, and without knowing it's Marcuse, it cannot be distinguished from identical sentiments from the woke right aside from a few leftist keywords. Quote, the whole post-fascist period is one of clear and present danger. Consequently, true pacification requires a withdrawal of tolerance before the deed, at the stage of communication in word, print, and picture. Such extreme suspension of the right of free speech and free assembly is indeed justified only if the whole of society is in extreme danger. I maintain that our society is in such an emergency situation, and that it has become the normal state of affairs. Different opinions and philosophies can no longer compete peacefully for adherence and persuasion on rational grounds. The marketplace of ideas is organized and delimited by those who determine the national and the individual interest. In this society, for which the ideologists have proclaimed the end of ideology, the false consciousness has become the general consciousness from the government down to its last objects. End quote. What Marcuse is describing above is considered ridiculous, totalitarian, and histrionic by most people. The woke right believes that most of society agrees with him and calls the tyranny he's calling for the post-war consensus. They would say when Marcuse says, quote, the whole post-fascist period, what he means is the post-war environment in which fascism has to be controlled, exactly as Marcuse articulates. They believe the world set up a system of power called the post-war consensus along these lines to exclude them as the lost, quote, true right, and that they're merely re-emerging from this Marcusean oppression now. As you can see, what Marcuse is calling for is the revocation of freedoms, including the freedom of speech and of assembly, to stop an alleged existential emergency. The woke right expresses the identical idea for the identical reasons, but not by invoking Marcuse. Instead, they invoke Carl Schmitt, the crown jurist of the Third Reich, and his concepts of the, quote, unbound executive and, quote, the state of exception, wherein an emergency state in society necessitates the sovereign leader to be completely unbound from the law and any other form of restriction on his action. While this is their justification for ending woke left in our society, it was also the justification the woke left used to perpetrate COVID-19 on us, down to the vaccine, quote unquote, being pushed through an emergency use authorization. Schmidt fleshed out these ideas most fully in a 1933 book written for the Nazis titled The Legal Basis for the Total State, wherein he explained why the Nazi government had a moral and legal justification for being totalitarian. Obviously, the Nazi experiment failed miserably, indicating it might not be a good way to go in our present circumstances. This attitude defines an inherent elitism in all woke, since allegedly they alone know how dire the circumstances are and what its true root causes are. They are elite and must lead. Those with critical consciousness are awake and must lead those with false consciousness who cannot possibly understand what is happening around them. Everyone in the way doesn't get it and must be destroyed. Woke is intrinsically elitist, though it pretends it isn't, and represents the common man, be that the worker, the minority, the displaced majority, or the nation's true folk. Woke elite theory. If realizing you're being lied to by a legitimately corrupt influence and stepping out of the matrix is taking a red pill, adopting a critical consciousness is like taking a handful of pills, some red and at least some black, as the metaphor goes. The red pill alludes to seeing reality as it really is outside the systemic power structure and its lies. The black pill refers to seeing the situation as hopeless outside of extreme, radical, and revolutionary measures. A red pill might indicate awakening. Several represents becoming a conspiracy theorist, and the black pill is just demoralization. While one red pill might be a necessary corrective, many are deranging, and the black pill is simply poison. The people who have already done this may come to regard themselves as superior to the sleeping others in their awakened, or historically elect, and not in the Calvinist sense, status, and deem themselves worthy to lead or rule. This is the backbone of the woke prescriptive elite theory, which follows from their acceptance and endorsement of a descriptive elite theory. I have explained these elsewhere, but will summarize briefly. Elite theory is the belief that elites are who rule society. Obviously, this is not some stunning insight, but something of a tautology. The people in charge are the elites, whoever they are. In general, elite theory goes on to try to figure out who the elites are by heredity, genetics, enlightenment, purity, or whatever else. That means a descriptive elite theory, which says elites rule, gives way to an elitist concept that certain people are themselves elite intrinsically and therefore rightfully rule. This develops into a prescriptive elite theory by deriving an ought from a contorted is. The elites should rule. Conveniently, most elite theorists regard themselves as the elites who should end up ruling. Woke is an elaborate scam for making false elites out of losers and outsiders, usually led by, quote, feds, who will co-opt the whole thing at the right moment. This activity is called a color revolution. Wokes tend to adopt elite theory to justify the idea that elites, meaning themselves, must always rule for the, quote, common good, which they alone truly understand. Believing in elite theory alone does not make them woke, though the enlightenment aspects they appoint to themselves do. Woke people extend this by then combining a fuzzy elite theory and elitism blend with the two key beliefs about knowing that define wokeness. First, the elites who rule now are illegitimate and corrupt, and second, they themselves are an awakened new elite who should replace them in the name of everyone's benefit. Speaking historically, Vladimir Lenin called this model the vanguard model, where the most theoretically literate Marxists would lead the revolution. The party he established around this belief was called the Bolshevik Party, and later became the Communist Party, which established the USSR. Hitler used the same concept in creating the Nazi Party, believing the masses of the folk to be too stupid to govern themselves, and thus needing absolute tyrannical authority from the awakened Nazis to rule and lead them, and specifically to lead them into war. Mussolini was different only in the particulars, rising out of the Italian school of elitism. Franco did the same in the name of saving Spain, using Catholicism. Summary of woke. What I have described above is woke. It may or may not describe someone's way of believing or acting in the world. Most people are not woke and do not think or act that way. Some people do. They are woke. Woke means having a critical consciousness. Woke doesn't mean anything more or anything less than this. Period. Full stop. Stop pretending it does. Woke bleeds over into believing the critically conscious have a unique right to rule and are the dispossessed elect who must reclaim society under their power, allegedly for the common good. This is a ruse. The structure of woke is as a cult with themselves at or near the top, as I will explain in the next chapter. Woke and wokish. Making things slightly more difficult, however, is that people adopt this way of seeing and acting in the world by degrees. That is, they can be a little woke. It is best not to think of people as being woke then, since it can vary how much critical consciousness they have adopted. But we all agree when that there's enough there, the person is woke. Why? Because they woke up. Simple as that. People can be woke for intellectual reasons by adopting the woke doctrine and theory, but much more commonly they are wokish for social and emotional reasons. Most woke-ish people do not accept the worldview, or wouldn't if it were laid out clearly to them, but they participate in it because their social standing depends on it. They may not even realize there is a doctrine, but are going along with the crowd and engaging in its practices, aka woke praxis, which they do not have to understand deeply to participate in. This causes them to get very upset when identified for being woke when they are in fact only wokish. Generally, I think it is best to reserve the term woke for people who are not just socially and emotionally caught up in wokeness, but to reserve it for people who are intellectually committed and pushing it. That is, to be woke, I think, or to merit that label, you have to be self-aware and having adopted a critical consciousness, even if you don't recognize it by the term critical consciousness. You have to know you woke up to a fundamentally different organizing principle of society based in collectivism and coveting power you believe you wrongfully don't have. Marx said as much about being a communist repeatedly. So this defines woke. In the subsequent chapters below, I will explain how this organizes the woke cults, including on the woke right, as well as how it pans out within the conservative movement and MAGA. The most important concept will be elitist capture, which astute readers can already anticipate from the discussion of woke elitism above. Chapter 2. The woke, the wokish, and the structure of woke cults. As I have discussed in the past, a lot, woke operates like a cult. It does so around the central conspiracy theory and elitism described in the previous chapter above. Woke operates like a cult because it is a cult. Cults operate in predictable ways, as I've described many times so far, and they are structured in roughly the same way every time, whether formally or loosely. The general structure of cults is that there are three main tiers within every cult, formally or informally, graduated further at times, as with Freemasonry, into 33 specific levels, or not, as with woke. There is an inner circle who knows what's going on. We'll call them operators and agitators. Below them is an inner school of adepts who have become intellectually invested and committed to the cult and know and push its doctrine. We'll call them wokes. Below them still is an outer school of initiates who have some degree of social and emotional investment in the cult, but who might not be deeply invested or even aware of its doctrines. We'll call them the wokish. The Wokish. By far, most of the people in a cult are outer school or wokish in woke cults. Woke-ish people have taken on some of the woke cult lenses, meaning they sometimes and partly see the world in woke ways, which means with some critical consciousness. And they act within it as such, engaging in transgression, social enforcement, virtue signaling, victimhood identification, polarized splitting, and so on. For people who are wokish, woke is mostly a social fashion with certain perks. It's an in-crowd they want to be in and to go along with. It's mostly, quote, just how all their friends act or how their friends see things. And it often takes the form of liking and hating certain things and especially people who are set up as villains by the tiers above them. They are sometimes referred to as, quote, fellow travelers, sympathizers, water carriers, or even foot soldiers by outsiders, all of which are terms of abuse that they project onto the various people with false consciousness outside of the woke cult in turn. The wokish are the primary victims of the woke cult, which is abusing them from above for their support and their allegiance. Woke-ish people will also frequently be very vague on why they think and feel the way they do about matters of critical consciousness, though they are filled with the talking points, examples, cliches, and especially virtue signals from the tiers above them that help define social membership in the broad movement, which is a cult in this case. Because their social environment is heavily influenced by and eventually totally dominated by the woke worldview, they have become increasingly isolated within the cult and become codependent on it in terms of understanding themselves. They seek to please the cult even at their own detriment. They are effectively codependent on the woke cult in disposition and practice. The woke. Above the bottom tier or outer halo of wokish people who have become socially and emotionally committed to the woke cult, there is a more definite group who is intellectually committed or otherwise invested as well. They are either grifters or awash in the woke ideology, and they push it. They usually know the theories defining cult doctrine and often care about them. They push woke theories and practices, including the abuse of outsiders, and explain the world in terms of them. They are victims of the woke cult who have become active abusers, rather than the merely passive abusers, as are the codependent wokish below them who take their cues. The wokes in this model are seen as leaders in thought and theory, as with Lenin's vanguard model, for the whole movement, and they set and spread most of the trends, cliches, talking points, virtue signals, etc. that capture the wokish below them. In fact, they are more akin to Mao's Red Guard, which he used and disposed of, than they are to the Bolshevik vanguard, but they will define the majority of the ranks in the party should the woke establish one effectively. The woke are not merely wokish, though, and it is not that they are not just that they are intellectually committed in addition to being socially and emotionally committed. They are actually woke, like woke up, except when they're grifters, who are also legion in this tier. Wokes believe the woke worldview is the correct worldview, and that everyone who doesn't get it is actually asleep. The wokish merely feel or intuit this. They understand the woke conspiracy theory to be the true but hidden operation of society. They can and do articulate it as such. They facilitate but only sometimes establish the incentive structures, both positive and negative, the woke cult offers to attract recruits and punish enemies and defectors. They name the enemies of the woke cult movement and put targets on them. They set the terms upon which the boundaries will be policed to keep the wokish in and too afraid to reject the cult or to side with any enemies. The mid-tier woke are the primary perpetrators of the woke cult. They themselves may not genuinely be psychopathological, but they have adopted a psychopathological worldview so thoroughly that they are functionally psychopathological. The wokish, by contrast, are only lightly functionally psychopathological for social reasons, like tribe over truth, fitting in, cult-captured psychosocial valuation schema, getting invites to things, and so on. They are often still normal, meaning the wokish are often still normal, particularly when interacting with normal people outside of the woke cult. This adoption of woke functional psychopathology as a primary mode of engaging the world is the primary distinguishing feature between woke and wokish. wokes, and grifters. One caveat here is that the woke tier is shot through with grifters who do not really believe the woke worldview at all, but who can articulate it so as to collect the woke cult rewards and mete out the woke punishments for themselves. This actually creates two types of woke perpetrators: genuine, who we should call wokes, and false, who we should call woke grifters. These are often completely indistinguishable even to people within the cult. The reason woke is so susceptible to grifter occupation and domination is that the woke worldview is ultimately very simple, though it's dressed up in lots of complicated theories. So it is very easy for unscrupulous grifters to mimic it, and the reward structures are often generous when the cult movement gets off the ground and gains power. In particular, the mode of woke is the critique of the existing structure, which any grifter or demagogue can easily do for clout, regardless of whether they believe what they're saying. It's also very easy to engage or initiate vicious piles-on of the enemies of the woke cult, which is a primary woke activity and signifier. The massive incentive structure attracts a different kind of psychopathology than unscrupulous and Machiavellian grifters, and it does so in large numbers and without much capacity for identifying or filtering them from its ranks. The woke are happy to use grifters, of course, because being woke is not concerned with truth or integrity, but only operational success. The grifters enable operational success, so they're not just welcomed, but celebrated in the ranks of the woke, at least earlier in the revolution. They will be the basis for many nasty purges later in the development of the woke power structure, but just as often, legitimate wokes will be purged by the grifters, who are more Machiavellian and more savvy in playing the nasty woke political game than their earnest but broken compatriots. True psychopaths almost always rise to the top of the woke cult hierarchy as a result. The inner circle, or, quote, feds. The real operators behind any woke cult are the kinds of amoral operator, psychopath, cluster B, personality disorder, and dark tetrad people Jordan Peterson has described as diagnostic of woke. This intrinsic corruption is partly because people of this kind will arrange cults, and the woke motif for a cult is a very simple and attractive model under certain circumstances, like mass grievance, alienation, or displacement, for mass recruitment. It is also because ruthless grifters and psychopaths will rise to the top of the woke hierarchies naturally, since the woke hierarchy is always based on playing effectively by woke rules and is not based on genuine competence. The inner circle of any cult is tightly guarded and highly elite, at least locally within its cult hierarchy. Very few people are allowed into or near it, though its members interface significantly with people throughout the cult, and are sometimes quite prominent as agitators for the cult. Some in the inner circle believe in the cult, that is, its ideology. Some merely see it as a useful tool to exercise power, that is, its tactics, which they view as amoral and available to anyone. That is, the fuzzy line between true and false members in the inner circle is just as relevant in the woke tier below, but with one crucial difference. At this level, only operators are allowed. You cannot merely be devoted or useful, you must be a fed in the broadest construence of that word. This tier directs the operation that the woke cult operates within and for, which always amounts to a revolution or coup for its own benefit. The inner circle of the cult will benefit most from this coup, and the entire structure will be arranged to ensure that. Take the example of the Communist Party as described by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto. In the first chapter of the manifesto, Marx makes the case that there is an intrinsic society and history defining conflict between classes, bourgeoisie and proletariat, or more generally oppressor versus oppressed. That is, he's woke, because he's expressing a critical consciousness. He says that the proletariat, which is oppressed, is naturally on the right side of this conflict and has the right to achieve a, quote, revolutionary reconstitution of the society at large, or, quote, the common ruin of the contending classes. In the second chapter, he then explains that the communists are the natural advanced segment of the proletariat who must lead them to consciousness and revolution. Naturally, Karl Marx and his cronies led the Communist Party. So Marx's woke cult structure was the proletariat as the outer school, an activated halo of wokishes, The Communist Party is the inner school wokes, and Marx himself and his cronies as the inner circle leadership class. Naturally, Hitler's infamous leader principle worked the same way. Woke elitist capture through, quote, inclusion and belonging. In woke cults, the inner circle sets most of the reward and punishment structures and hands them down to their operatives in the woke tier below to impose upon 4 specific target groups: the woke below them, the wokish entirely to, quote, keep them on the plantation, their declared enemies, but punishments only, and the general population, but offering rewards only in order to recruit them. They usually have or are connected to ample means to make reward structures attractive: galas, cocktail parties, exclusive invites, other parties, paid opportunities, funding, networks, access, etc. by the time the woke cult movement gets off the ground, and sometimes from the outset. This explains recruitment. There is a model for woke inclusion and belonging, and if you play ball with that model, you're included and you belong. If not, you are excluded and punished. The punishment structure is mostly directed at declared enemies, plus any defectors who have waded into and then back away from the woke cult's worldview and reward structure. They are scapegoats and traitors and are treated as such. Punishing enemies is rewarded in the reward structure. Enemies are viciously made examples of primarily as a show for the cult recruits. The cult takes a risk to punish an enemy because it risks damaging recruitment possibilities, even with all those reward incentives dangling out there. But it readily takes that risk because it is much more valuable to have all members and people in its halo, or potential recruitment territory, terrified to speak out against the cult at all for fear of loss of rewards or of direct punishment. The punishment of enemies is therefore geared mostly to signal to the people already captured by the cult that if they deviate, they will lose status and all hope of accessing the rewards incentive structures. The same threat is a message sent to the recruitment field around the cult. In the case of the woke left, that would be all liberals in the bad American usage of the word, and in the case of the woke right, it would be all conservatives. The process of woke elitist capture. Many within the wokish outer circle and most within the woke middle ring of the cult strongly desire or covet access to the woke cult reward structure and will compromise themselves tremendously to get at it. Quote, everyone has a price, they say, and not necessarily just in terms of money. It is very hard to resist this carrot stick, access threat, inclusion, exclusion incentive structure once it is clearly laid out to you. Therefore, the inner circle arranges it such that there is no access possible except to people who bend the knee to the woke cult in some degree, at least by staying silent about it or outwardly supporting it. This is called social capture, thus making you a wokish initiate. Certainly, no one who opposes or exposes the woke cult can have any access to its reward structure, and many must be punished publicly as well as privately. The woke cult, we all recognize, operates within this structure, whether with fancy cocktail parties, elite invitations, opportunities to write and publish with prestigious outlets, access to academic circles that got increasingly tight over the years, and through sprawling professional standards. Heaps of money and fancy opportunities were open to those who participated in severe punishments, including personal and professional destruction, including many induced suicides, rained down on its enemies. The woke right does not control society overall, but only the MAGA ecosystem within it, so their power is not as absolute, but operates identically within its own large, wealthy, and powerful subdomain of society. In addition to much else specifically within the MAGA ecosystem, the woke right currently sets access to the President of the United States and all associated glamour and opportunity as the crown jewel of its incentive structure. They also control most of the elite MAGA tier of MAGA and its opportunity structure, including media appearances, network, paid speaking spots, invitation to exclusive parties and events, and a huge and influential social circle of, quote, it people. The woke right effectively control the elite tiers of the MAGA ecosystem already, indicating the first phase of their structured revolutionary coup is already complete. Summary. In language that is more familiar but less comfortable for the right, what this means is that the inner circle of a cult sets an inclusion and belonging paradigm that is laced with desirable rewards and policed with terrible punishments, particularly in terms of status, standing, opportunity, and access for being at least wokish. The wokish get to play in that field, and the woke who are more effective get genuine but mostly lower-level big opportunities within it. The whole thing is corrupt. The way you can tell the whole thing is corrupt, even on a casual glance, is by noticing that the conditions for access and the triggers for punishment are all based in what the left boldly called inclusion and belonging, and the cult on narrowly set ideological and social terms, with strict gatekeeping and guilt even extending to gatekeeping by association. Whatever you do, don't be associated with James Lindsay. Everyone, at least intuitively, also understands the opposite. Thus, the punishment structure is exclusion and ostracization, which is psychologically and professionally almost impossible to bear. Woke cults are evil. Conclusion. If you don't agree with this structure, you will badly misunderstand what is going on with woke cults overall. You will think people who are merely wokish are woke, or vice versa, that the movement is much more organic than it is, and that it's actually all motivated and stimulated by genuine concerns and natural social needs and dynamics. None of this is true, and it can be very difficult for normal people to understand this fundamentally psycho and sociopathological state, because normal people, by definition, don't have those states. Remember, woke is a way of seeing the world and acting within it. One of the ways woke acts in the world, then, is to erect a cult-like structure as described above and enforce it with both rich worldly rewards and strict demonic punishments. We will next turn our attention to understanding the similarities and differences between woke left and woke right, not that these are the only two ways woke could manifest. Chapter 3. Woke left and woke right. The woke cult can manifest itself through virtually anything. Whether or not it is intrinsically a left-wing phenomenon boils down to a real and unsettled debate about what left means and is unproductive. I will adopt the prevailing nomenclature here and will take for granted that people who self-identify as being on the left are on the left. And likewise, I will take for granted that people who self-identify as being on the right are on the right. There's almost nothing productive to be gained by disputing their own self-identifying political status as left or right, though I sympathize and understand why one might do so, both for good and bad reasons. I will offer a particular organizational description of left and right in alignment with how their radicals engage with idealistic societal organizational forms. These are anti-hierarchy and enforced hierarchy. Woke means having a critical consciousness. Again, that's all it means. Nothing more, nothing less. People who have a critical consciousness and advocate for leftism are woke left. People who have a critical consciousness and advocate for rightism are woke right. I don't mean anything other than this by the terms, and I don't think you should either. What is woke leftism? As noted above, the woke left, previously just woke, refer to people who self-identify as leftists, advance leftist causes, and have critical consciousness. That is, they are woke or wokish. Understanding the woke left, therefore, requires understanding leftism. There are a variety of ways to define left, but in the context we're all most familiar with, leftism pushes a kind of radical egalitarianism as a societal ideal. Radical egalitarianism refers to a deeply radical view of equality that not only seeks to generate total social, economic, cultural, and political equality. Its extreme is what the Soviets called actual equality, fatocheskoye ravенstvo, and what we call equality or social equity. Leftism does not merely seek to establish radical equality in many cases, but also to make up for historical inequalities as a mechanism to achieving present equality. Note that the reparations component of equity, then, is a means to an end, not the end in and of itself. In a real sense, the ideal of leftism can therefore be described as a radically anti-hierarchical worldview that rejects all hierarchies, both legitimate and illegitimate. This idealistic rejection of all hierarchies, which is impossible in practice because hierarchies always result from any set of ground rules that define the operation of any society, explains why Marxist communism believes that at the end of its period of enforcement, which it calls socialism, the result will be a, quote, stateless, classless society in which there is plenty and everyone is a complete equal. It believes this is only possible by training people to be radically egalitarian, brutally in direct proportion to their unwillingness to accept this anti-human and anti-reality model voluntarily. The result is, of course, extremely hierarchical, with the party on top, favored people next, and enemies last and rejected, all in the name of being anti-hierarchical. Radical equity is enforced on the middle tier of people most. The party rewards itself, and enemies are destroyed in the meantime. The leftist eye is on the idealized state, though, which is a radically egalitarian and perfectly and voluntarily equal society in all ways. Thus, we can understand leftism, no matter how unrealistic it is, as alignment with radical egalitarianism as the societal ideal. This view is not necessarily woke until it adopts a critical consciousness for why society is not already radically egalitarian. Then it becomes woke leftism. This fact about woke leftism gives it a marketing advantage that helps it survive even after it causes society to spiral into destruction. It appears superficially to have good intentions. In fact, its real intentions are to take power for itself and attempt to radically transform all human beings in society into something that they neither can nor ever will be, but at least it's because they care about equality, or so people think. Eventually, that it is radically unrealistic becomes a marketing hindrance once that fact is exposed. Because it is radically egalitarian, the woke leftist worldview is therefore a critical consciousness about hidden, embedded, structural, and systemic inequalities in society. They believe that these inequalities are intrinsically due to injustices in the organization of the system itself, and that the system itself is therefore unjust and needs to be replaced by one that is radically egalitarian. They believe they have woke up to a critical understanding of why the society we have generates inequities, and that they alone can remedy those to achieve their radically anti-hierarchical perfect vision for society. The woke left worldview is that people in power illegitimately have rigged the system to exclude the real voices who could make it radically egalitarian. They are alleged to have done this both wittingly and unwittingly to help keep society unequal in ways that benefit themselves. So they are evil or complicit in evil, even if only through negligence. Therefore, they, meaning the woke leftists, have to be forced from the margins and into the center, while the people who support the existing system have to be ejected and marginalized because they aren't woke to how the system is said to really work. All woke thinking is ultimately class-based, which is to say collectivist, as we discussed earlier, so the woke left organizes its class structures among the less successful members of the given society who it can convince are structurally disadvantaged by the existing system by their social class. It awakens them to a woke critical consciousness of their conditions by teaching them Marxist class conflict explanations for why they aren't doing better than they are in society. Paulo Freire calls this process conscientization or awakening. Outsider classes can be defined in a wide variety of ways. Economic class gives us Marxism. Race gives us critical race theory. Sex gives us feminism. Sexuality gives us queer theory. Immigration or citizen status gives us post-colonial theory. Body size gives us fat studies. Mental health gives us madness studies, as we saw from Foucault. Criminal status gives us prison abolition movements, etc. But in the woke leftist model, they have to be regarded as outsiders, as a class against the dominant power structure as set up by the dominant classes of people. The theoretical model called intersectionality, which is described as a practice and not a theory, welds these outsider groups together in solidarity against the alleged dominant power structure that they say is designed to maintain inequality, which is the only way they believe they can obtain power against the prevailing power. Thus, woke is collectivist, including woke leftism. The woke view is always that the outsider classes, meaning the other, is alienated by the system of power erected and maintained by the groups who benefit from it, the so-called dominant groups. It alienates them from their rightful heritage in a perfectly egalitarian society which they believe represents our true but lost human nature. They have come to believe could and would exist if it weren't for the dominant group's selfishness and lack of self-awareness. Marx described his program as, quote, the complete return of man to himself as a social, that is, human being, and said that it can be accomplished by a single command: abolish bourgeois private property, that is, enforce transformed radical egalitarianism. The woke left uses various critical theories according to its radical egalitarian worldview, which it calls social justice. Since a critical theory is defined by its creator Max Horkheimer as being unable to describe an ideal society on the terms of the existing society, and proceeds instead by criticizing those aspects of the existing society that fail to be ideal and that they wish to change, this means woke leftism looks for inequities and blames them on social injustice that's baked intrinsically into the system, since only they can correctly see it and only they can correctly understand it by having woken up to it. Only they can be allowed to fix it. That defines their power grab and their elitism, which is done in the name of radical egalitarianism or equity or social justice, all of which refer to the same thing. What is woke rightism? Woke right is a term that refers to people who self-identify as right-wing. Woke right is a term that refers to people who self-identify as right-wing and who push for nominally or genuinely right-wing causes from a critical consciousness of their circumstances, meaning they are woke or wokish. Understanding the woke right is slightly more complicated than understanding the woke left because the right is not typically woke until it is sufficiently provoked. It tends toward traditionalism outside of provocation by the woke left, though it is entirely possible that it can be woke independently of provocation, because woke just means having adopted a critical consciousness. Being a traditionalist does not necessarily make someone woke, even if that puts them outside of the classical liberal tradition. This means we have two things to explain to understand the woke right: rightism and reaction, and they are not quite the same thing. Rightism should be defined here in a sense that is the opposite of the way we defined leftism, as would stand to reason. As there are many ways we could have defined leftism for better or for worse, rightism could be defined in opposition in many ways as well. For good reasons, however, we have characterized leftism as radical egalitarianism, which is to say a radical view against a hierarchical society. This allows us to understand radical rightism, though there's an important caveat here that I'll have to explain momentarily. And radical rightism is a radical preference for strictly enforced hierarchies as the basis for social organization. In some sense, this means woke right lends itself more strongly to elitism and elite theories than does woke left, although in practice the woke left adopts these and is just lying about it in their idealistic hope that they can be totally overcome. 2 points bear elaboration before continuing. One is the meaning of the word radical itself. The other is the notion of radical rightism as favoring strict and rigid enforced hierarchies and how that differs from favoring natural hierarchies. Radical means roots. So a radical political position refers to pulling up the existing system by the roots and putting down new roots for a new system. It doesn't just mean being zealous or a fanatic or caring a lot or being mad. It means wanting to have a revolution of some kind against the current system. In America, that necessarily means removing and replacing the Constitution that constitutes our country. As for hierarchies, reality is simply this. Given any set of base rules for any system or society, a hierarchy will form around those rules, at least by competence. The thing is, a system's hierarchy can be defined explicitly or not by that system. When it is not defined, it will emerge naturally through competence in the existing system. Most systems present some explicit hierarchy. For example, the president will be the chief executive. The American system aims to minimize explicit hierarchy as much as possible to allow the maximum amount of natural hierarchy to arise in the context of what it calls just powers of government. The founders understood that the ideal would be the natural hierarchy, but that nature tends to be brutal enough to make that state in practice a cartel-driven and faction-driven hellscape without some rigid order. On the other hand, they understood that a rigid and absolute hierarchy, explicitly defined without checks and balances to power, would simply be a government-run tyranny. Because A, the woke left is radically anti-hierarchy, B, natural hierarchies will always emerge, C, some explicit hierarchy is called for to maintain order, and D, the woke right is radically pro-hierarchy. The woke right, as well as fascism preceding it, has a better marketing program in some ways to people in that it's more realistic than the leftist alternative, even though it's still wrong. Leftism calls for something most understand to be idealistic utopian nonsense, while rightism calls for an extension of something that naturally occurs, just in a bad way. What woke rightism doesn't benefit from is any benefit of the doubt. Their program is rabidly in favor of enforced hierarchies that are quite brutal and often nakedly malicious and arbitrary. The public does not forgive them for this like they do woke leftist idealists. So a failure of woke rightism always hands tremendous moral, social, and political authority back to the left, usually for the duration of living memory. The unfortunate marketing fact that woke rightism is more realistic than woke leftism in some ways is doubly true when leftism has been on the march and making a society completely disordered. Hierarchy seems to be in desperate enough need to justify doing it radically. And this is where we find ourselves now, by the way, thanks to the woke left. So radical rightism can be understood as the desire to pull up the existing system and install and enforce a rigid hierarchy in its place, usually in the name of some notion of a better time in the past before things allegedly went sideways. The natural hierarchy under a light touch central government is considered too weak and enabling of too many freedoms and must be replaced with an enforced artificial hierarchy. Woke right is therefore intrinsically statist, and in a way the woke left can deny. The woke left lies to its followers about an ideal of a stateless society and so claims to be anti-statist, but by statist means. The woke right is simply vigorously and permanently statist. Woke right as reaction. By comparison to leftism, radical rightism is a radical cry for too much order, frequently in response to leftist chaos, that is, anti-hierarchy. This brings us to the other dimension of radical rightism, which is not necessarily traditionalist or pre-modern at all, namely reaction. Reaction is often taken to mean far right, but it is in fact radical or woke rightism in its defiant and often angry reaction against leftism, including woke leftism. The attitude motivating reaction is that things have already gone too far for too long and enough is enough, which may well be true. The goal of reaction continues that energy, however, so we're going to take control and put things right by any means necessary. That's less wholesome. Radical rightism is often, though not always, a radical reaction to radical leftism. The left comes along and causes problems, and the right responds by overreacting in the opposite direction. Historically, reaction has tended to take the form of same energy, opposite direction in its approach. That is, it recognizes the tactics and modes of leftist agitation, it accepts leftist premises about society, and in response adopts them itself to, quote, fight fire with fire. Historical examples include fascism responding to communism. So fascism as a reaction to communism. Fascism is not well understood in what it is, which is to say, anti-communist reaction, and it will help us to understand the woke right to understand fascism as a form of anti-communist reaction. In essence, when communism, which is woke left, comes on the scene and demands radical egalitarianism and equity and uses destructive critical methods to go about getting it, society goes into a crisis, which is to say a pre-revolutionary state. This is called destabilization. There are three ways the society can go from there. First, it can firmly reject radical egalitarianism in favor of its founding principles. Second, it can fall to woke leftism. Or third, it can react with radical rightism. Weakly standing for the founding principles or just carrying on will certainly lose to the woke left and is therefore considered part of that second possibility. The first of these prevents a revolution but requires resolute commitment to the founding principles and the willingness to consistently begin to defend and execute them. The second gives us a red or Marxist revolution. The third gives us a white or fascist revolution. Fascism, in essence, is adopting the woke critical consciousness model of communism while rejecting completely its radical egalitarianism, and in fact reversing it for radical hierarchicalism. Put otherwise, where the woke left sees inequity and hierarchy and says injustice ruins society, the reactionary woke right sees inequity and hierarchy and says justice runs society. Justice that runs society. In other words, the woke left or communist view is that inequity and hierarchy are bad for society, and the woke right view is that inequity and strictly enforced hierarchy are what makes society work, and they always were. Therefore, fascism presents itself as both anti-communist, which it is, and the only way to be anti-communist, which it is not. As Italian fascist Benito Mussolini, the father of Italian fascism, put it in The Doctrine of Fascism, quote, "Such a conception of life makes fascism the resolute negation of the doctrine underlying so-called scientific and Marxian socialism, the doctrine of historic materialism, which would explain the history of mankind in terms of the class struggle and by changes in the processes and instruments of production to the exclusion of all else," end quote. To you, that might sound good, but it's not all Mussolini said. Mussolini's fascism is reactionary, not just anti-Marxist. He quickly continues, quote, "After socialism, fascism trains its guns on the whole block of democratic ideologies and rejects both their premises and their practical applications and implements. Fascism denies that numbers as such can be the determining factor in human society. It denies the rights of numbers to govern by means of periodical consultations." By the way, that means elections. It asserts the irredeemable, infertile, and beneficent inequality of men who cannot be leveled by any such mechanical and extrinsic device as universal suffrage, end quote. So he's against voting. Under fascism, as a reaction, there will be no natural hierarchies because natural hierarchies cannot be trusted. There will be no government deriving its just powers from the consent of the governed. The fascists are too elitist to require that assent or to accept it. And conversely, the governed are regarded as too stupid and incompetent to give it into the right things anyway. Under fascism, there will be a rigid enforced hierarchy instead, and it will be totalitarian. Mussolini tells us it, quote, "rejects the individual, That is, it is collectivist, and it relocates all of its values into the state. That is, it is statist. As Mussolini said, the fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state, a synthesis and unit inclusive of all values, interprets, develops, and potentiates the whole life of a people. No individuals or groups, political parties, cultural associations, economic unions, or social classes outside of the state. Fascism, then, ultimately is a woke right reactionary doctrine. Woke right historical romanticism. Both woke left and woke right are historicists. What this means is that they write historically based stories that make their ideology for their present revolutionary ambitions seem correct, inevitable, righteous, necessary, etc. The woke left tells a mythology about how the entire history of the world, after some decisive moment of injustice, erected a system of injustice that produces inequities. The woke right tells a mythology about how everything was great, if not golden, up to a certain decisive moment when some enforced but natural hierarchy was disrupted and caused society to go into the toilet. The woke left therefore tells a historical fall of man story where we cast ourselves out of Eden by introducing some terrible social injustice into history, thus initiating the conflict that defines history. In Marxism, it's the advent of private property. In critical theory, it's the introduction of racism. In feminism, it's the apartheid of the sexes with women as the second sex. In queer theory, it's the acceptance of norms, legitimacy, and normalcy at all. By contrast, the woke right tells a romantic tale of a past socio-cultural glory day that was interrupted by the attempt to make things too fair for people who never deserved it. The woke left wants us to return to Eden on our own terms in defiance of God. The woke right wants to assume the mantle of the Lord of hosts and drive man forward into the inheritance it would have had if we hadn't been displaced from our rightful historical trajectory by undesirables and degenerates. Thus, the woke right historicism tells a romantic story of a rightful but local, that means to the nation or to the race, elitist hierarchy whose members have been unfairly displaced from their inheritance by alien interlopers who came in and broke the system by claiming it wasn't fair enough. They are the alienated rightful inheritors of a society that wasn't allowed to be because it deviated from the rightful elitist hierarchy they have rediscovered and aimed to reinstall. Oppression, they realize, was making the system work in the past, and they figure it will make the system work again now once it is embraced and enforced. Whereas Marx and the woke left believes the system of power has negated who we are as human beings, as in dislocated our humanity, the woke right believes in a system of power that has negated who we are as a people who deserved better than we actually got. The woke left believes people are intrinsically socialists, anti-racists, and queer, and have been alienated from that state by the unjust imposition of a system of power that creates inequalities and hierarchy. The woke right believes people are intrinsically a nation, a race, or a culture that used to be glorious but has been polluted, and who are thereby alienated by the unjust imposition of a system that refuses to recognize their intrinsic and inalienable claim on the fruits of their own society and tolerates the interlopers. Woke right elitism and the Führer principle. The woke right vision for society, then, is a return, with a V, to the organizational principle of an earlier instance of their society in which the rightful heirs to their society, who are themselves and people, quote, like them, were dominant and not displaced, and this hierarchy will be reinstalled and rigidly and brutally enforced since the people can no longer accept it naturally. It is a story, then, of a dispossessed and alienated but rightful elite returning into their own and setting things right after things have eroded or fallen apart. Rather than cobbling together the less successful members of a given hierarchy and installing resentment in them for how the system was created to fail them, as does the woke left, the woke right cobbles together people that are less successful members of a given hierarchy and installs resentment in them for how the system was supposed to work for them all along but was stolen from them illegitimately. Resentment is at the bottom of both woke models and defines the critical consciousness both woke models adopt. This means, in practice, the woke right will create a class-based or collectivist identity around not just factors that are meaningful to right-wing people like kin, tradition, and national identity, but around the sense of resentment of being a dispossessed, natural societal elite whose inheritance has been robbed from them. National sentiment gives way to hyper-nationalism and ultra-nationalism, for example, where the identity group becomes the true Scotsman who is always meant to inherit the fruits of the lost golden system, say, for example, in Mussolini's Italian fascism. Identity politics located in nationalism or kinship, usually meaning majority races, can erupt and arise, as with Hitler's National Socialism. Cultural identity politics tend to arise in national and religious identities, as with Franco's attempted reunification of Spain in a nationalist way through Catholic identity, which was cultural and religious. Because of the rightist bent toward rigid and enforced rather than merely natural hierarchies, the woke right will establish a rigid and enforced hierarchical structure that they believe will return them to glory and their lost inheritance. In its extreme, this model was named the Führer Principle, leader principle, by Adolf Hitler, though he derived it at least in significant part from Mussolini's model of the fascist state. The Führer Principle describes an absolute pyramidal shape hierarchy of top-down control with total obedience at every subordinate level, all based on enforcing and serving the party and its ruling woke ideology. Thus, where the woke left ideal is absolutely no hierarchy or radical egalitarianism, the woke right ideal is total hierarchy, what Carl Schmitt and Aaron McIntyre at the Blaze call the total state. As Mussolini said about this model explicitly, it is totalitarian and it is spiritual. The woke right has accepted that the total state is an inevitability, so it might as well be their own total state. This is similar to the woke left belief that the total state is an inevitability, so it might as well be their own total state. The woke left believes the state exists to enforce class division and takes the oppressor's side in the resulting class conflict, so they have to seize the means of production and establish what Lenin called a semi-state that will force everyone into socialism so it can, quote, wither away of its own accord. Paulo Freire despaired of this condition and said that following the raising of critical consciousness and the Cultural Revolution was the need for more critical consciousness and another cultural revolution. The woke right, on the other hand, believes that the state exists to enforce class division and takes the oppressor's side in the resulting class conflict so that the state and its society and its people will endure and advance forever. The belief in inevitability of something terrible The belief in inevitability of something terrible, so it needs to be the right something terrible, is a woke belief. It's also incredibly mystifying. Not only does it feel like it must be the case and thus bring people into existential fear and madness, it also removes anything but the radical extremes from consideration. If everything really is brainwashing, then of course we must brainwash correctly. If every state really is a total state, then of course we must have the right total state. If every society automatically will have a state religion, then of course we need it to be the right state religion. The thing is, not everything is brainwashing. Not every state is a total state, and a state will not always have a state religion, either in the de facto sense, much less in the de jure sense. As a final note, it is crucial to distinguish the rigid and enforced hierarchy of the woke right from the natural and fluid hierarchy of a free society. In a free society, there is hierarchy, and that hierarchy is precisely as legitimate as it is based on competence, not only in the system, but to the degree that the system is itself aligned with or in correspondence with reality. Competence in a psychopathic woke socio-political game defines the hierarchies in practice on both woke right and woke left, but it is not genuine competence in alignment with achieving real goals in reality. It is in both cases instead competence in a suite of artificial, pathological force and Machiavellian power games that a healthy, free society aims to minimize in their impact on its natural hierarchies. What makes the woke right woke? What makes the woke right woke is having adopted a critical consciousness of their circumstance, including the identity class-based thinking that comes along with it. These dispossessed, alienated elites, like their woke left counterparts but differently, have a form of enlightenment based on who they are and how they suffer. They are the rightful inheritors of the society, so they understand it on a deeper level than others. They are also alienated from it, so they, quote, know what time it is, in terms of having been dispossessed and alienated and thus full of resentment. There is little different from what's going on the woke left, but for different reasons. Both have adopted a system of social authority based in their identities, which is called standpoint epistemology. Both derive an unquestionable right to rule from their belief in their own awakening. On the woke left, the belief is that having been alienated from society by the dominant powers that erected the system in the first place gives true insight into a second dimension of human experience known as alienation. Thus, they have special authority and insight into the true nature of society and gain right to rule through it. Their rule is meant to liberate mankind to his true, perfectly and radically egalitarian state, which they refer to as human nature. On the woke right, by comparison, the belief is that having been alienated from society by an illegitimate interloping alien force that has erected an illegitimate system gives true insight into a second dimension of human experience known as alienation. Thus, they have a special authority and insight into the true nature of society and gain the right to rule through it. Furthermore, on the woke right, however, there is an added belief that the identity factors, be they national, kinship, or cultural, that they hold were the rightful ones, not just for humanity at large, but for their specific people. And therefore, they have an even greater standpoint-based authority and right to rule. They also refer to this as human nature. The self-serving belief structure is one of the factors that make the woke woke. It applies, as you can see, on both woke left and woke right, though slightly differently. A second crucial factor is the belief that insider knowledge is part of the corrupt system, and therefore outsider knowledge or other ways of knowing that is specifically critical of the existing or corrupt system is superior. This belief is the basis of the special authority that is described above in both cases. If the system is corrupted as they maintain, then that which is outside the corruption must be more likely to be true. So goes woke logic, especially if it criticizes or challenges the existing allegedly corrupt system. This is a woke attitude toward knowledge. It's taking too many red pills, so to speak. It is also called having a critical consciousness. Summary of the woke right. The woke right has adopted a critical consciousness of its standing in society, regarding itself as the dispossessed and alienated true right wing and rightful inheritors of a system that was corrupted by tolerating a wicked alien power they alone fully understand and can resist. They are woke by dint of having woke up to this belief system. Again, woke means having a critical consciousness, nothing more, nothing less. The most important factor in understanding the woke right is that they view themselves as dispossessed and alienated as a people, be that nation, kinship, or culture, corresponding to Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco, not as being dispossessed and alienated from their very humanity, as with the woke left, who locate humanity itself in radical egalitarianism. Of course, the woke right tends to locate its humanity in its received identity as a people. So there isn't much daylight here between the two except in the particulars. Put otherwise, the woke right doesn't care about so-called humanity, it cares about inheritance. That is, the location and rationale for resentment is fundamentally different between woke left and woke right. What is not different is being woke about it. This fact means that the expressions of woke right will be ultra-nationalistic, racialist, as Hitler had it, but it means racist, and culturally chauvinistic and supremacist based on a belief that establishing a rigid enforced hierarchy to mandate a particular view of these factors is the only way to return the rightful heirs of a society to their inheritance. Key among this belief is adopting intolerance to the perceived alien interlopers. Now we can turn our attention to how this worldview and cult structure interfaces with MAGA and drags it into a woke right calamity. Chapter 4. The current phase of the woke right MAGA revolution. We begin with reiteration. MAGA is not woke right and is not a woke cult. Again, MAGA is not a woke cult. MAGA is, however, significantly captured by a woke cult that has gained the name woke right. This section will explain the idea of cult capture in the specific context of MAGA and the broader conservative movement in the United States, though it applies analogously, though imperfectly, abroad as well. To remind you of my specific claim, it is that the woke right exists as a woke movement in right-wing modes and is every bit as revolutionary and radical as the woke left. It uses the same critical consciousness operating system, though differently and for its own particular ends and societal structure, which will be highly ordered and hierarchical versus comically egalitarian. As a radical right-wing movement, the woke right is doing a revolutionary coup of MAGA, then conservatism, then society, all in stages. The first stage of that coup has been capturing the elite stratum of MAGA, which it has completed. It will then use that capture to take over MAGA, then conservatism overall, and then society, if it can and if it is not stopped. That is, the current stage of the revolution is leveraging the MAGA elite against MAGA itself. The previous stage of the revolution was capturing the MAGA elite, which it mostly did quietly over the last several years. Of course, in parallel, the woke left spent the last half a century or longer slowly doing its coup in similar fashion. First, the elite circles were captured. This was done at least by Obama's second term in office. Then the coup of the Democratic Party proceeded in 2015 and 16, as led by the Justice Democrats and the Squad. Then all of left-leaning America was conquered during the 2020 and 2021 riots and pandemic, not to mention Trump derangement syndrome before that, and they very nearly took the United States in total. That is, they were well into stage 4 of their coup, whereas the woke right is only in stage 2 of its coup. The trajectories of these two revolutions will be similar, though it is my belief that the woke right has no hope of completing its own revolution and is ultimately a foil to allow the left to complete its revolution instead. In short, the left set their table for decades and did it well, and reaction has energy but not the broad support necessary to accomplish its ostensible aims. It can, however, sink the MAGA ship. This section is devoted to explaining the mechanism of the woke right coup, which is the most important part of the essay, or I guess podcast, and its actual purpose. Elitist capture. The incentive structure I described in Chapter 2, emanating from the inner circle, aka feds, and through the wokes, or adepts, and aligned grifters, down to the wokish, who are the initiates and fellow travelers, generates a phenomenon we must understand called elitist capture. Elitist capture is the name for when an elite group within a movement defines the cultural, aesthetic, linguistic, and behavioral norms that are considered both superior within that group and indicative of group belonging. They therefore also set up a set of signals one can make, called virtue signals, that indicate inclusion or a kind of bid or application for inclusion into the, quote, cool kids club or inner cliques and their halos and its opportunity structure. The most prominent and familiar example of elitist capture to everyone in our society right now is how every university, professional association, HR department, and major institution all signal woke left. Being woke left, specifically intersectional, enviro-communist, socialist, etc., is a necessary component of belonging and inclusion in those captured social and professional spaces. And so regardless of one's beliefs, most of them conform or signal conformity. The woke left managed over decades to extend this elitist capture to much of polite or, quote, educated society, thus defining the current woke problem we generally all recognize and are trying to fight. In short, liberal normies have largely accepted woke elitist capture. As you can see, there are two forms of elitist capture happening in woke movements then. Internal, within the high-status cliques and elites, and then external, within the movement below and around them, bleeding out into all of society eventually, if possible. Both of these forms of elitist capture operate together, though in earlier phases of the revolution, it is crucial to focus on the inward-facing capture, which then turns more and more outward as the revolution progresses through later stages. Progress from one stage of revolution to another is generally referred to, by the way, as power consolidation. Elitist capture runs through a set table. Part of the insidious nature of elitist capture is that by adopting the modes and mores expected for inclusion and belonging into the elitist defined structure, people slowly capture themselves into the underlying worldview defining that structure. By using the captured language, captured motifs, captured aesthetic, captured social cues, including likes and dislikes of people, ideas, and things, etc., whether by adopting them or as mere virtue signals, they do work on a person's social and individual psychology, as well as their capacity to articulate the world outside of the elitist defined structure and its worldview. Elitist capture doesn't work just through paying people off or compromising them with blackmail or threats. It works through setting trends, styles, and brands, including for what it means to be, quote, cool, or here, based, and included, as well as for who is to be avoided and to be hated as a signal of not being cool, or here, cringe, or generally contaminated. It is easy to understand how social, emotional, and linguistic cues can conquer someone's psychology. People want to fit in, often desperately, but an example of capturing one's worldview is in order because that's more difficult. By adopting the elitist-defined framing and language for a phenomenon, it becomes increasingly hard to talk about that phenomenon, which might be very relevant or important outside of elite defined and captured terms and framing. Eventually, the terms, language, and framing underlying worldview or lens become the way you understand the concepts themselves, making it very difficult to articulate the associated phenomena outside of the captured framing and terminology, which you then spread to others. You have experienced this if you have ever tried to explain a woke leftist position, say like transgenderism, without using leftist language for the phenomenon you're trying to talk about. It's frustrating and it completely disempowers you while eroding your discernment. It also pulls you in. It's also subtly transformational. Wokes often get you with their captured language first, which lures and leads you and eventually traps you into their worldview. And looking into ways to talk about the phenomenon of interest, which many people are likely talking about if they're politically engaged at all, you find yourself stuck having to study, read, hear, and re-articulate through captured terminology, even if you're trying to learn about the topic in a detached or critical way. This slowly contours how you think about the issue yourself. On the woke right, for example, it is very popular to blame a lot of what's going wrong in the world today on a fairly nebulous concept known as the, quote, post-war consensus, referring to the various ways we approach national and international politics and economics since World War II, speaking generally. This is captured terminology, which means it has more than one thing it can refer to, one of them ideological and based on the woke worldview, and the other more general and quotidian. By accepting that the problem is something called the post-war consensus, which is woke right captured terminology, even if you don't agree with them, a person slowly loses the capacity to talk about the geopolitical considerations of the world since World War II outside of those captured terms. Much of what you will read about the now unveiled problem will be on captured terms written with its ideological commitments woven in. Slowly, the points raised by the woke right, some of which are good points with bad interpretation, which is common with all wokes, start to be the points you also make as you engage with the term that mainly they are talking about, because it's their terminology and therefore captured linguistics. Eventually, the worldview that informs their use of the world impresses itself upon you, and you begin to adopt pieces of it. Congratulations, you are now a wokish initiate, even though you probably don't recognize it about yourself. You are now vulnerable to the full suite of woke elitist capture techniques. The temptation of MAGA by woke in the desert. Once wokish or even adjacent, as discussed, the inclusion and belonging reward structure opens up to you. The elites behind the elitist structure at hand, or the wokes below them with sufficient means, can and will make more and more offers to you within their growing institutional frame of influence and opportunity, or sometimes with just cold, hard cash. All of this is contingent. There are some things you should or should not do. I did not read that right. I apologize. I don't think I wrote it right. There is something you should or must do, and you must also not say or do if you want these rewards. So you learn performativity, self-censorship, and self-criticism to enable these opportunities. This is the first step of selling your soul to the woke cult, which is ultimately Luciferian down to the last jot. Along with these opportunities, you'll increasingly be made or become aware of people who are being punished for speaking against the woke cult, or even just differently to it, and or against the elitist framing of the world or the cult. You cannot get too close to these people, or everything you're being offered will be at risk. Now you're no longer freely associating because you're associating on cult terms, which carries guilt by association. Now the various incentives and social and emotional binding mechanisms are available to you and visible to you. Status, opportunities, new friends, esteem, praise, keeping old friends, and the constant threat of loss of all of these over trivialities. This process is called elitist capture. The woke create a false elitism and expand it through this diabolical machinery, using it to capture more and more people, most of whom never will be elites. People who are generally regarded as elite potential recruits are vigorously targeted, and both the rewards profile and threat profiles presented to them are stark and overwhelming. It's not just love bombing, it's great jobs, network access to the president in this case, tons of mover and shaker opportunities, amplification, gross monetization opportunities on social media, and so on. The threat is the absolute destruction of your elite status in the broader movement if you don't go along with all of it. Put plainly, stars within MAGA who are not woke right are heavily recruited and heavily, if only tacitly, threatened to join in with rich reward or else. We all see it happening, and I bet you can name a few people you're worried about right now. If we're talking about the woke cults, this is how they make you wokish. That is, this is how they initiate you. Once you're at the gateway, the incentives look marvelous, and turning back looks barren by comparison. I encourage you all to read Matthew chapter 4. Once you come in, if you come in, the world opens up to you. The catch is that your soul cannot come with you, for that way is too narrow. MAGA and elitist capture. Most of MAGA is not woke right, but MAGA is powerfully captured by the woke right worldview and its inclusion and belonging structure of elitist capture. The elite tier of MAGA is more or less controlled by this structure now. That phase of their revolution, which is phase 1, is already complete. The next phase will be using the MAGA elite to capture MAGA at large, or if that's not possible, as Karl Marx had it, to achieve, quote, the common ruin of the contending classes. That is, they'll take over MAGA or destroy it entirely. That's the woke right mission, and it comes from the Tactics of Karl Marx, which are free for anyone to pick up, even though they come from his demonic inspiration. Destruction are the wages of woke. Or as President Trump said, everything woke turns to shit. As noted, elitist capture of MAGA is at work in two ways at once to have made this happen and to continue making it happen. These two modes are inward, among the elites themselves, and outward from the elites to everyone else. In order to begin describing both, let me explain two things. First, this is how power consolidation works in practice in general. Understanding this and its application to MAGA will lead to clarity on why a common talking point about criticizing the woke right phenomenon is utter, if not malicious, nonsense. Power consolidation works from the inside out. First, you capture the elites, with elite capture in the first sense, which is inward-facing, and then you capture the party, with elite capture in the second sense, which is outward-facing. Only then do you capture the general population, which is also facilitated by the elite capture, but can be enabled by direct application of power. This is what Mao Zedong did in China between 1923 and 1949, which is when he finally assumed power. First, he consolidated power within his central cadres. This was done via the Long March and at Yan'an from 1934 to 1935. Yan'an became one of the most famous and sacred places in Maoist China as a result. Second, he consolidated power through the entirety of the CCP in the early 1940s, driving out what he referred to as the left factions and the right factions. Only in 1946, after consolidating his power and against a war-crippled China, did he then launch his bid to take over China at large, which succeeded finally in 1949. Of course, Hitler did the same pattern through the early 1920s, proceeding to the next phase in the late 1920s before taking power ultimately in January of 1933. The current stage of the MAGA revolution. My argument here is that MAGA is progressing from the first of these phases, which is now complete, to the second one, which explains most of the crazy last few months. It has established elitist capture of what I'll term, quote, elite MAGA, and is now seeking elitist capture of all of MAGA. Only after that will it seek to capture all of conservatism or all of America, if it can get that far. Therefore, it is irrelevant in the extreme that the woke right doesn't hold any significant institutional power in the U.S. ecosystem at large. It doesn't matter that they don't control the bigger picture leftist institutions. They're not going for those yet at all. They're staging an insurgency to capture MAGA itself, which they claim they will then weaponize against those broader societal targets. The argument is that this counterinsurgency model is the only way to stop the left, which is fraught at best and a ruse at worst. At the current stage of the woke right revolution, they control almost all institutional power in the MAGA ecosystem, which is their current target. What they have outside of it is currently irrelevant. This is why their main target for activism at present is the Daily Wire, which represents the largest and strongest media institution in the MAGA ecosystem that is still outside of their control. When someone says that the woke right doesn't control any major institutions or that it's, quote, fringe, they're missing the point entirely, often very much on purpose, by the way. Its entire sphere of relevance at present is only within the sub-ecosystem of MAGA, not the super-ecosystem of the American socio-political landscape and economy. Woke right is currently rapidly doing a coup of MAGA only. which will lead it toward its ultimate ambition of a full revolution or coup against the United States. Second, not all MAGA suffers elitist capture yet. In fact, we need a more refined and discerning view of MAGA overall to understand how this works. The current objective is for all of MAGA to be captured, and it hasn't been captured yet. In fact, a large and increasingly influential sector of MAGA is fighting back against the woke right, hopefully just in time, and hopefully effectively. This is the MAGA Civil War. Tiers of MAGA. That's Tiers, not crying. To make easier sense of this, I need to split MAGA into 3 spheres of influence that I'll call Elite MAGA, Middle MAGA, and Normie MAGA. Normie MAGA represents most of the people in the movement, and they're almost all good, decent Americans who are passionate patriots who want to make America great again. They are generally not activists, however. Middle MAGA is made up primarily of the people doing the heavy work within the MAGA ecosystem. They're showing up to hearings, writing, teaching, reading, organizing, running for offices, and everything else. What they aren't is influencers or celebrities. Some of them are not quite famous, but most are less visible, though no less important, and often more important than almost all of the influencers. They're the massively unsung heroes of the MAGA movement and its ambitions to make America great again. Elite MAGA is its celebrities and influencers, and I purposefully exclude Trump from this group because Trump is Trump, and Trump is singular in his everything. They may or may not be American elites, but they are MAGA elites. They are big fish in a now pretty big pond. They set the trends, deliver the talking points, participate in the pageantry, and all that celebrity stuff. Most of them have very low-risk, soft jobs, such as in alt media and politics, and sometimes think tanks, but most think tankers are relegated to the upper and middle rungs of middle MAGA. Their world is niche, elite, and ephemeral. It is heavily aesthetic. It is a cool kids club, and it is both subject to elitist capture inwardly and capable of engaging in elitist capture outwardly. I will add also that whatever their sentiments in their hearts about making America great again, elite MAGA largely has Make America Great Again as an aesthetic fashion that it wears. My contention, again, but in these new words, is that elite MAGA is almost entirely captured by the woke right and is working to capture the rest of MAGA as described above. Middle MAGA is mixed, but is increasingly becoming aware of the woke right and rejecting them. Normie MAGA lands all over the place with this regard and mostly isn't aware of the fight, except that they are dimly aware of an ugly fight that, quote, hurts MAGA, that will have to see people take sides, which is what makes them Normie MAGA. They are also largely and significantly demoralized and rely heavily on favored MAGA influencers to make sense of the world around them. How elitist capture works in MAGA and elite MAGA. As for the two forms of elitist capture of MAGA, both work generally the same way. The key dynamic of the entire process is the inclusion and belonging elitist capture mechanism controlled by the woke right through elite MAGA. Your ticket into elite MAGA inclusion and belonging is at least staying silent, if not positively signaling or supporting woke right people and initiatives, using their language, shunning their enemies, etc. Of course, you also have to be useful to them in the coarsest sense of the word. That is, history uses people and then discards them, as Hegel said. On the other hand, your boot in the ass out of elite MAGA and its faux glitzy halo is defection from the woke right, of which I have personally been made a stunning example, but not only me. This is why so many influencers who should know better about the woke right remain dead silent or are playing dumb. The woke right may not butter their bread, but they control access to the butter and increasingly to the bread too. On status games and elite MAGA self-censorship. The biggest threat to elite MAGA, by the woke right is revocation of their elite status. If you are or aspire to be elite MAGA with all its captured perks, you have to support woke right things, or at the very least, keep your damn mouth shut. You also have to be useful to them, and you have to distance yourself from their enemies, if not join in the attacks against them. Otherwise, you will be ostracized and cast out of the elite status. That is, you will suffer status loss. Status loss is very difficult to bear psychologically, socially, and professionally. Look at how many who left the left, so to speak, talk about the horrors of the great unfriending, cancellation, and the experience of ostracization. It's much more than losing professional opportunities, though that's very important too. On the woke left, it eventually led to unbelievable personal tragedies, including suicides. These were common in Mao's China as well, for similar reasons. Everyone to a person in elite MAGA fully understands that if they deviate too far from the woke right, regardless of their principles or values or their contributions, they will be cast down into middle MAGA, where some of them might have to do real work. And there will never be another big opportunity or point of access for them ever again. Most of their current, quote, friends and professional networks will shun them by necessity for the exact same reason, to avoid going down with them or just behind them. They will not be going to any more galas or official cool things at the White House. They won't be speaking publicly much, especially on big stages or going to big shows. They will be regarded as cringe, and they will be over. They're cooked without credibility or acceptance. This, by the way, is called cancel culture or cancellation. It's the vicious exclusion side of the inclusion and belonging mechanism of elitist capture. It may not destroy you in society overall, as could the woke left, but within the niche ecosystem in question, it damn well can and will. The result is simple. Even the people who know it's wrong will keep their mouths shut and play in the reward structure offered to them as long as they can. The woke right doesn't yet control society, or even conservatism, or even MAGA. They control elite MAGA circles and are using them to engage in woke right elitist capture against MAGA itself, just like the woke left did on the left a decade ago. Again, everyone in elite MAGA knows every bit of this, too. The MAGA Civil War. This is why I say elite MAGA is already captured. Phase 1 of the woke right revolution against MAGA is complete. Elite MAGA is already cooked. Elite capture by the woke right perspectives is already complete in elite MAGA, and there are a few that overlap, all of which are woke with different conspiracies about how society works, interacting roughly intersectionally and in modest solidarity. It isn't currently progressing, it is past tense already. Elite MAGA has already fallen to the woke right by the mechanisms of elitist capture. Many are now familiar with the paradoxical construction, "it's not happening, but it's good that it's happening," associated with woke behavior. This self-contradictory expression refers to the tendency for outright denial of the radical movement to enthusiastically embracing it, and to the fact that for a time you will see both arguments deployed simultaneously. What this phrase is actually describing is a phase shift in the revolution, which explains why some will persist in denial while others progress to enthusiastic embrace as that shift unfolds. That means the phrase signals a point of shifting power. Before they obtain the power to execute mass elitist capture of the movement, radical movements must use disguises, or as it's said now, quote, hide their power levels. That gives us "it's not happening," which remains in place until after phase 1 of the coup is complete. Once the elites are under radical control and can thereby usher elitist capture to the masses, "it's not happening" shifts to "this is what's happening and it's a good thing," in the attempt to bring the captured elitist enthusiasm to the whole movement. You could add in, "and the people who disagree are the problem" at any point in here. That is, this phase is indicative of the early portions of phase 2 of the revolution through the rest of it. While the woke right is not embracing the label woke right now, they are certainly embracing clear outward expressions of radicalism as what's happening. They've embraced elements of Karl Marx's analysis, critical theory, postmodernism, and characterized themselves explicitly and clearly as, quote, not conservatives and as, quote, radical right-wing revolutionaries. They are declaring victory within elite MAGA as they march forward. This has been undeniable to any alert observer with its overt woke elements like open expressions of radicalism, open use of Marxist analysis, open embrace of critical theory and postmodernism, and enthusiastic application of slave morality and cancel culture, all since December 2024. So began the MAGA Civil War. Now, many within middle MAGA still do not understand this inclusion and belonging mechanism because it hasn't and won't make them any great exclusive offers. But they intuit that their access points require being politic, which is to say politically correct on woke right terms. Their intuition keeps them silent on the issue because it's absolutely crucial to the other objectives they're trying to accomplish. Not necessarily because of potential bigger opportunities in the elitist captured reward structure. They're trapped by a corrupt elitist capture of the broader structure that they need to make their work effective, which is within MAGA overall. These people in middle MAGA, the unsung heroes of the movement, need certain influencers and politicians on board with their work. They need support and connections, opportunities, amplification, and everything else. And they have some of that sometimes. They cannot destroy their reputations within MAGA by bringing down the ire of the cancel mobs and smear campaigns. They cannot be branded, quote, not real conservatives or some kind of a problem by the influencer so-called elites that their colleagues listen to. They have to avoid all the drama to get real things done. They're trapped by the same elitist capture mechanisms and sometimes know it, but they're too small to have any real options in most cases. This is how elitist capture is extending from elite MAGA into middle MAGA, although middle MAGA is becoming aware of the corruption and starting to fight back. This fight back against the woke right and its elitist capture of MAGA is the current MAGA Civil War, as some people are calling it. It's worth noting that because middle MAGA does not have the same glitzy opportunity structure that elite MAGA has, their engagement with the elitist capture is fundamentally different. This is what allows them to be the ones who will rebel where the elites will not, the elites being fully captured. Elitist capture of normie MAGA from the bottom up. Normie MAGA, for its part, is being pulled in through their institutions and fandom, and they are being played through their demoralization. On the one hand, they support their stars, and on the other, they are demoralized. They are not easily able to tell what is true and what is false, and instead must rely upon other factors, including popularity, MAGA consensus, which is called parology, and personality to make those decisions. They have seen how lied to and subverted they have seen how lied to they are and subverted our institutions are, and being unable to believe in any of them anymore, they will believe almost anything, so long as it's rightly oriented outsider knowledge. Even when they are not wokish to the right, they are disposed toward woke rightism. That is, they are well within the woke right target recruitment field. Elitist capture of normie MAGA proceeds similarly but differently to how it operates in middle MAGA, where middle MAGA has objectives to accomplish and aspires to possibly gain access to some of the elite MAGA tier or perks. Normie MAGA has no such aspirations or opportunities. They need to know what to believe, and they're searching for voices they can trust to tell them what that should be. Where middle MAGA can be elitist captured by the grips of the movement in the reins from the hands of elite MAGA, and is in the hands of elite MAGA, normie MAGA can be elite captured by the winds of the movement as they blow from elite MAGA, and it shows. Normie MAGA knows it has lost the backbone societal institutions. Worse, their key remaining trusted institutions are being infiltrated right in front of their eyes, even if they don't recognize it. This includes their alt media and their churches. Again, woke right is not yet making a bid for America at large, but for the MAGA specifically, and the conservative movement generally, and the main institutions they can infect are the MAGA alt media, political institutions, and churches. This dynamic is the so-called top-down but bottom-up dynamic of counterinsurgency movements and color revolutions. Thus, we understand the much less visible Christian nationalism movement, which actually has mostly hidden deep ties into elite MAGA, for example, through Yoram Hazony's national conservatism, which is in the White House through the vice president, which isn't just directly and strongly supportive of Christian nationalism, but also includes characters like Albert Mohler and others who know how to play this game very well. The Christian nationalist movement is a purposed attempt to bring the American Christian conservative into woke right elitist capture through their most trusted, valuable, and sacred institution through deliberate manipulation. That is, it is a political movement disguising itself as a theological movement and moment. Summary. To summarize, the woke cult has a fully developed inclusion and belonging, that is, elitist capture mechanism, with rich rewards including access to the President of the United States and brutal punishments for enemies and defectors within the MAGA ecosystem. This has already achieved them a near complete elitist capture of what I have termed here elite MAGA. The first phase of the woke right coup is complete. Power is consolidated in the elite tier of its target ecosystem, and they can now turn that elitist capture outward to capture the rest of MAGA. The woke right objective for now is to expand this elitist capture of elite MAGA to the rest of MAGA, which is the second phase of the woke right revolution against MAGA. The mechanisms are described above. They are clear and they are simple. They are also being executed at blinding speed. My rough estimates, if I had to guess, would be that elite MAGA is at least 90% internally captured by woke right in one of a few typical ways: through rent and opportunity seeking, through going along with the flow and the positive momentum, aka vibes, or simply by silencing people who know better. The remaining 10% in elite MAGA represent grifters and active perpetrators, what I've called feds in the broadest construence, assets, or plants. Only a few people in elite MAGA dare to speak out, and not all of them can hold on to their elite MAGA status once they do. This is an extremely bad and dangerous situation for MAGA, and thus for America. Middle MAGA is starting to realize what is happening and fight back, which is becoming ugly now. The so-called MAGA Civil War, or War for the Right, it's being named. Normie MAGA is less clear and is more detached and confused. A few members of the elite MAGA group, including yours truly, have spoken up and paid the price as examples to the rest. We have been cast down. Meanwhile, the pot of incentives elite MAGA has access to offer on their captured terms continues to grow for those willing to play the game as the movement advances in an increasingly woke right direction. People far enough outside the elite bubble all wonder the same thing. I hear it everywhere I go. What the hell is going on? What about Trump? Trump remains a wild card, as he would. The woke right will take him, but see him generally as just a vessel to accomplish some other things until they can get their true, quote, right wing, meaning radical tyrant, in power. That's what they did to me, so I understand the mechanism. It is their method, after all. It is history uses people and then discards them, just like we see on the left. I'll pause and tell the story. I was told 4 years ago in January of 2021, so 4.5 years ago almost, that my work was very useful to the woke right people I was talking to, so they will use me for now, but when the time comes, they will force convert me or kill me. They didn't quite kill me, but they have discarded me, so they killed me professionally. We call that cancellation. They will do the same to Trump if Trump doesn't go with them. This puts Trump in a precarious situation. If he goes along with them, that is, if he goes woke, and everything woke turns to shit, he has a problem. If he resists them, then he initiates a full-scale MAGA Civil War and a splintering of his base coalition. As the midterms approach, this only gets more poignant and difficult in every single way. The woke right is therefore holding MAGA hostage, with Trump and the midterms left in the lurch. During this stage of the revolution, as Phase 1 tightens its grip on elite MAGA and Phase 2 progresses, the woke right will try to do as much as they can through Trump without him realizing it, attempt to turn him to their side, possibly, and eventually turn on him completely in the effort to get their radical tyrant in power. They're so desperate to win in the long run that they have articulated that they don't mind destroying MAGA or even Trump, or even that we end up under the thumbs of the woke left Democrats again for a time. Their view of that situation is that another slog through leftist tyranny will further awaken the people to the so-called need for a truly right-wing leader who will be their tyrant. The woke right therefore want MAGA to turn fully to their control or to be destroyed, which is how all wokes operate within the movement they attempt to parasitize. This is where we are. This is the state of the woke right revolution against MAGA. So that's the long essay. As you heard, I'm going to have to edit it a little bit, but that's all right. I hope you found it clarifying to what I think is going on in MAGA. The very, very short summary is woke means having critical consciousness. Woke establishes a cult that has a mechanism to create a false elite that can establish a mechanism of elitist capture. Woke can appear on left and right. They're extremely similar, but they manifest slightly differently. Woke left is radically anti-hierarchical and approaches the idea of any hierarchy in society with critical consciousness, which is a conspiracy theory view of it, that it was erected to keep them out of power so that nobody can be free. Woke right approaches the issue favoring radical enforced hierarchy and believes that the past state of affairs was superior and that they, as the rightful inheritors of the society they could have had, need to seize power and establish a firm enforced hierarchy that forces people to play along with the vision of the past that they have written, such that they are no longer tolerant of the polluting and corrupting elements that have weakened our society to the state that it's in now. And then finally, that MAGA is undergoing a revolution. The mechanism of that revolution is elitist capture. They have already captured MAGA elite, or elite MAGA as I called it. They do that through largely status and professional opportunities that are very hard to ignore, combined with vicious cancellation and mockery and punishment of people who defect or who don't go along with them. I have personally experienced that and can testify that it is very unpleasant, but it's also not going to make somebody like me stop. And their goal is to take this Phase 1 revolution where they've captured the elite through elitist capture, through opportunities and status, and to weaponize that to capture the rest of MAGA. What's actually happened is that the middle part of MAGA, the hardworking activist group, which varies in status pretty widely, from virtually unknown people getting a lot done to very well-known people getting a lot done. What characterizes all of middle MAGA is getting a lot done and not just being a damn celebrity. That these people are very rapidly awakening to the fact of the woke right and its problem, to the elitist capture problem, and they are becoming very concerned and they're very angry, and some are very rapidly increasing in number, I should say, are starting to fight back. And this has created something like a MAGA Civil War. The MAGA Civil War is not caused by middle MAGA. It is not caused by the people speaking out. The MAGA Civil War is caused by the people on the woke right who have tried to do a radical coup of MAGA and of conservatism and of eventually the United States, if they can get it, for their radical hierarchical vision of society that they wish to impose upon us. Rejecting this in the name of maintaining America as in a country that rejects this radical elitism is absolutely not provoking the war. It is self-defense. And so iron law of woke projection never misses, and the victims are being blamed by the perpetrators as they're being called out, as one would expect. But at any rate, this is the state of affairs. I think it's a very precarious situation. As the midterms come close, I'm very nervous. They put this heavy deadline clock on the whole scenario. If woke right continue to gallivant as they are, I think it's not just that we're going to lose the midterms for the Republican Party side, but we're going to get completely blown out. Trump will become largely ineffectual. He will probably get impeached by a Democratic Congress. 2028 will not be a pleasant ride for Republicans either. And I believe ultimately, as I've said many times, that this is the real ultimate purpose of the woke right, though many people firmly do believe it. It's not just a Fed operation. The top-down, bottom-up structure that I mentioned is that the top-down sets the tone. That's your elitist capture, and the bottom-up goes along and makes it look like an organic uprising from just following their influencers who are actually planting the ideas that are meant to cause the problem or generate the revolution. So this is what I think is going on. This is what I think the woke right is. I hope you understand the woke right better, why I call it woke, what woke is, which was generally useful before we started talking about the woke right and is even more useful now. But mostly I wanted you to take away the concept of elite capture, elite capture means something else. Elitist capture, which is where you control the social and political circumstances and professional circumstances around a movement through the generation of an elite status or a false elite status that requires people to play ball within it. And I hope you also understand how it's similar to the temptation of Jesus is depicted in Matthew 4 by Satan, and understand why the woke right is an evil movement. So again, hopefully this was clarifying for you. Thank you for listening. Share the podcast or the essay accompanying it, and I will talk to you again in the next one.